So today I'm here with Ido Aharoni. He is a global distinguished professor at New York University. Could you tell us a little bit about the new diplomacy and kind of what that means to you?
So new diplomacy is actually the type of diplomacy that brings into consideration the tremendous impact of technology and the new changed reality we're all facing. So for example, if traditional diplomacy was all about representational skills and the ability to communicate and advocate and present your country's policies, then in new diplomacy you're also required to have marketing skills and storytelling skills, and you also have the task of being measured. In traditional diplomacy, there was no measurement of your success. People spoke about, let's strengthen the ties. What does it mean to strengthen the ties? But in new diplomacy, there are metrics. How many tourists did you bring this year? How many foreign investors did you bring? How many cultural assets did you expose? And so on and so forth. So that's one very big change. Another very big change is the fact that in new diplomacy, you're also considering urban centers, not only nation states. And lastly, new diplomacy is also about your own public, your own domestic arena. In the traditional world, diplomacy was about working overseas. The role of new diplomacy is also to reach the level of buy-in of your own people first to your national ethos, to your national narrative that you're trying to market in the world.
Awesome. So we talked a little bit about listening and how that's important. How can we as citizens and as nations be better listeners?
Well, nations and people, I always believe in the personification of nations. I always tell my students, imagine if Israel was a human being, if America was a human being, if Russia was a human being, how would you describe them? It's a very effective way to understand how people feel about that. So one of the ways to do it and to improve the ability of people to listen, what is listening really? It's a capacity. It's like a disk. What is the size of your disk? What is the size of your hard disk? How long and how long can you absorb information? So it's about curiosity, it's about perception of knowledge, and above all, it's about the ability to get other people to join in promoting good things, things that will improve the world. So when you have that mindset, by definition you have to listen, because you cannot form a partnership without listening. If every country was only about itself, there'll be nothing, there'll be no human progress. But the fact that we have to partner in order to make things happen, I think is very, very important. So listening is incumbent upon us because this is the new way of the world. This is technology. Technology eliminates national boundaries. The internet knows no boundaries, and I think that puts a great responsibility on all of us to be more attentive and listen and listen and listen.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about how effective diplomacy can never be aspirational. Can you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yes. So diplomatic strategy. What is strategy? Strategy is the principle that you accept that will organize everything that you know, everything that you want to do. So for example, we say that Israel's strategy is creativity and Israel's creative spirit and the celebration of creativity and so on. So if you express and articulate a strategy that is not well rooted in your reality, it's never going to work. So when I say that your strategy can never be aspirational, is like saying, I am something I'm not, or I am something I would like to be, and just not going to work. So your strategy always has to reflect something that you are. You have to work with your existing assets. And because at the end of the day, diplomacy is about a simple, basic truth about a place, about a policy, about an ideology, about a people, about a nation, about a culture. It doesn't matter, but it has to reflect a simple, basic truth. It also has to reflect the totality of the experience, right? So for example, when we talk about New York, People know New York as the Big Apple. The Big Apple reflects the totality of the New York experience. It's the size. That's why it's called the Big Apple and not just the apple. And the apple stands for something, right? The apple stands for diversity, for an eclectic nature of the place. The apple in the Bible stands for temptation, right? So New York has this seductive power. It's luring you in. That's why it's called the Big Apple. And people relate to it because temptation is not necessarily positive. So it's about the totality of the New York experience. In New York, you get the plus and the minus, the good and the bad. But it's the totality that attracts you.
How can we embrace creativity in public diplomacy?
Well, diplomacy, unfortunately, suffers from an ongoing failure to embrace creativity, just like any other bureaucracy, because people, when they become part of the organization, there's a process called socialization. When they become part of the organization, they're actually being squeezed into the box rather than being trained to think outside of the box. Why is that happening? Because organizations that put procedure before substance, and that's the definition of democracy, of bureaucracy, organizations that put procedure before substance have a very difficult time coping with people that come up with new ideas. Those new ideas, they take the organization out of its comfort zone, and they actually create a great deal of inconvenience to their fellow workers. They create a great deal of inconvenience to their superiors. And so the tendency in bureaucratic organizations is to actually suppress them. I always call it the superiority of mediocrity. Those organizations that they force you to be mediocre, not to be creative, not to think outside of the box, because it just creates a huge organizational problem. How can you change that? It has to come top down, and it has to come bottom up simultaneously. Top down meaning the leadership has to embrace creativity. For example, the state of Israel was blessed to have a founder who was extremely creative, and his name was David Ben-Gurion, who believed in creativity and was not afraid of change. But most people are afraid of change. Although change is the only permanent things in our lives, people still do afraid of change. And one of the ways to cope with this is to simply educate your own people, your own organization, your own students in your case, that change is not something to be afraid of. Change has to be embraced, and the only thing that we need to do is better prepare ourselves to cope with change.
Can you tell me a little bit about the Brand Israel program?
So the Brand Israel program came out of the realization that no place in the world would like to be defined by its problems. And unfortunately, Israelis and Israeli leadership constantly communicated Israel to the world only through the prism of its geopolitical hardships, right? So the question was, are you supportive of my policies? Who do you support in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and so on and so forth? And we are right and they are wrong, and all those type of questions. And the assumption was that this is a zero-sum game. If you support Israel, you don't support the other side, and vice versa. And what we discovered shortly after 9/11 through a series of studies is that this is really not the way it works. People may politely say to you, yes, I support you, but actually what really matters is not what they think about you, but what they feel about you. And so we started to look at the emotional landscape, starting to try to assess what is the quality of the emotional connection that people have with Israel. And that was the beginning. And what we discovered was very, very disturbing. We discovered that Israel was better known than liked. So people knew a lot about Israel, or at least they thought they knew a lot about Israel, but they weren't attracted to what they saw. And so we said, what will attract them? That is not aspirational, that is truthful and attractive. And we discovered that we didn't have to go far. It was right in front of us. And it was Israel's unique creative spirit. And once we started communicating that, this is a place where you can be inspired by all forms of creativity. Whether it's in the cuisine, or on the dance floor, or in the army, in the laboratory, in startups, what have you. Creativity is the name of the game. All of a sudden, people developed an interest in the country, started to come to Israel. Tourism went up 400%. since we started. And of course, foreign direct investment went up. Everything, basically, when you look at the performance of Israel, everything changed. And who's branding Israel? Not the government. The people of Israel are branding Israel. The community itself. So I'm a big advocate when it comes to nation branding of what we call the concept of non-centrality of government. Governments, their job is to spark the process, to ignite the process, but then it has, after there's a buy-in of the Israelis themselves and the people that love Israel, the process actually takes a life of its own, and that's exactly what's happening now in Israel.
So in 2009, a book came out called Startup Nation. Could you explain a little bit about how that's affected society today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Startup Nation was a great conversation piece. We, in the Brand Israel program, we purchased 10 or 15,000 copies of the book to distribute when it came out in 2008. And, but unfortunately, outside of the community, not a lot of people are aware of the fact that Israel is a technology powerhouse. And I still am amazed when I travel to universities outside of New York and Europe and Canada, how very few people are actually aware of Israel's advantage in the field of creativity and innovation. Another thing about Startup Nation, it's important to note that Israeli creativity is not just limited to startups. Israeli creativity is manifested in all walks of life. So Startup Nation is a great piece of the puzzle, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. There's more to it.